We're told by 9/11 truthers that the Twin Towers were brought down in a controlled demolition, and as proof of this, they point to what they claim is clear physical evidence, thermite chips that were found in the dust after the collapse of the buildings. Here's what they argue in the documentary 9/11 Explosive Evidence.
In the World Trade Center dust, an international team of scientists find an advanced form of highly energetic nanothermite composites. What is it, and where does it come from?
In the dust, we found what we characterize as unreacted thermitic material in the shape of some very tiny red-gray chips. And in the reaction, they produce molten iron, which is the prime indication of a thermitic reaction. And such a reaction can be used to destroy steel structures.
Dude, nice dramatic emphasis there. What is this, Shakespeare in the Park or something? This argument might sound like it's convincing and intimidating, and it becomes seemingly even more so when you read the Niels Harrit et al. Paper that these claims were first published in. It's 25 pages long, it's written by 10 different authors, and it's filled with all kinds of technical analyses and scientific jargon that might lead you to believe that clearly these guys know what they're talking about. A careful examination of the paper, however, shows that reaching the thermite conclusion is not at all justified by their research. They started out by gathering 4 different samples of the dust that was collected by 4 different individuals shortly after the collapse of the Twin Towers. The first major drawback to their study is that the request for people to send them samples of this dust was only first made in autumn of 2006, 5 years after the buildings collapsed. While we're assured that the samples themselves were collected in the immediate aftermath of the collapse, this large time lag between collection and analysis is definitely a major drawback. We're going to assume for the sake of argument, however, that the samples are completely trustworthy and uncontaminated in any way. What does their analysis yield? In all samples collected, a number of chips were found that were red on one side, gray on the other. The gray side is predominantly iron, oxygen, and carbon, whereas the red side is mostly carbon, oxygen, iron, aluminum, and silicon. The authors then present what I can only call a very bold hypothesis. Quote, "The existence of elemental aluminum and iron oxide leads to the obvious hypothesis that the material may contain thermite," end quote. A much more reasonable starting point than jumping to such an incredible conspiratorial explanation would be to ask, did anything inside of these buildings match both the appearance and chemical composition of these chips? The primer paint that was used to coat the structural steel of these buildings is the same color as the red side of these chips. Look at pictures of the towers during construction, and the bright red steel is impossible to miss. So if you found a bunch of red chips in the debris of such a building, wouldn't this be the go-to hypothesis rather than high-tech incendiaries? Why go with the explanation that requires way more complicated assumptions than you actually need to explain the observations? Truthers, let's just say, have some very creative ideas for how this thermite could have been used in a manner that matches up with the observations. In the Harrit et al. Paper, they surmise that perhaps some sort of secretly developed nanothermite was painted onto the steel. They cite a report on a 2001 conference which said, quote, "At this point in time, all of the military services in some academic laboratories have active R&D programs aimed at exploiting, bloody wankers are exploiting exploiting the unique properties of nanomaterials that have potential to be used in energetic formulations for advanced explosives," end quote. The authors then claim that, quote, "the energetic nanocomposite can be sprayed or even painted onto surfaces, effectively forming an energetic or even explosive paint," end quote. Please stop to consider how utterly absurd this explanation is. We know that the steel of the World Trade Centers was covered in a red paint. When confronted with what looks exactly like chips of this very red paint, in what seems like the most open and shut case imaginable, truthers say, no, this actually isn't red paint. Well, actually, it sort of is red paint, it's just not the red paint you're talking about. This paint is a different red paint that also happens to be an explosive nanocomposite that was developed in secret laboratories. Could anything be a better example of needlessly complicating what is very easily explained? It's like someone says, Anton, why did you drive by me earlier and tell me to go fuck myself? And I'm like, what? That wasn't me. It was just someone who drives my exact car with the same set of bumper stickers in the exact same license plates. And the person happened to look exactly like me and is wearing the same thing that I'm wearing today. But I can assure you it wasn't me. Must have been some kind of clone or something that was developed in a secret lab. We know that there must have been red paint present in the debris, given that the millions of tons of steel in the buildings was covered in such paints. It would only be remarkable to not find any red chips in the debris, given that there was so much red paint applied to the steel in these buildings. So here's my question. What happened to all of this red paint? Did it magically vanish during the collapse of the buildings? Even if we conceded that yes, the towers were brought down in a controlled demolition, wouldn't you still expect to find a bunch of chips of this red primer paint in the debris? Do truthers present us with any reliable way of distinguishing between the red paint that obviously should be there and the red thermitic material that they claim is also in the debris? No, they don't, and they don't even attempt to make a distinction between the two. They simply assume that any red chips in the debris are the thermitic material, and this to me is a clear demonstration that they've simply gotten their explanation wrong. You might say, oh, well maybe the spray-on thermite burned up all the primer paint, and that's why we don't find any of it. Okay, well if there's so much unreacted thermite in the debris, presumably there'd be a bunch of unburned off primer paints. And it's not like they could, or even would need to, access and coat every steel beam in the building to bring it down. So why the lack of primer paint? Why did it all just completely disappear? Did the conspiracy involve a magician as well or something? Is anyone actually going to answer the specific points I'm making here, or are they just going to dodge them all and say, what about Building 7, like my last videos? As if Building 7 is my fucking kryptonite or something. Look, I can't comprehensively debunk every single truth or argument in one video, so why don't we just focus on what's in front of us for now? And when I do make a video about Building 7, people are probably going to say, what about the thermite chips in the dust? So you know what, you guys can fucking blow me. They point out to us that around the time of 9/11, the state of nanomaterial research and development was such that the kind of technology they're talking about may indeed have existed. Here they're making the common mistake of confusing the mere possibility of something with the probability or certainty of that thing. Just because a piece or category of technology might happen to exist, doesn't mean that that technology was necessarily used in the manner you're talking about. For example, pointing out the fact that advanced laser weapons may indeed exist, in and of itself isn't proof that that's what killed the burn victim. So I don't care if you can show that your explanation is conceivably possible. What an incredibly low bar to set. The more important question is which explanation is most reasonable, and the thermite hypothesis simply doesn't pass that test. An explosive spray-on nanothermites. I'm wondering what else do they work on in that secret evil lab? Johnson, excellent work with that spray-on nanothermite. What do you have for us today? I've designed a tiny microscopic airplane that sprays micro chemtrails inside of your home. God damn it, Johnson, you've outdone yourself this time. Fantastic work. Hey guys, if you're enjoying this video so far, make sure to check out my full conspiracy theory playlist, and also subscribe and click the bell to be notified when new content is posted. Yeah, I mean like right now. Subscribe and click the bell. Come on, I'm waiting. Okay, thank you. Now, where were we? Truthers would disagree with my analysis, and they claim they've proven the chips are not paint in a number of different ways. Architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth, for example, writes the following, quote, "Some defenders of the official 9/11 story have claimed that the red-gray chips are simply remnants of the rust-proofing primer paint that was applied to the steel structure of the World Trade Center skyscrapers during their construction. However, several key ingredients of the primer paint are not present in the composition of the red-gray chips. According to NIST, the type of primer paint used on the World Trade Center steel columns contained substantial levels of zinc, chromium, and magnesium. However, the X-ray energy dispersive spectroscopy analysis of the red-gray chips, performed by Harrod and others, showed no significant amounts of zinc, chromium, or magnesium," end quotes. When you actually look at the chemical analysis they're referencing here, you find that they're simply misstating its results. All you have to do is look at the spectrum, and you find that the red side of the chips does contain the elements they say it doesn't. Figure 14 from the Harrod et al. Paper, for example, clearly shows that the chips do contain zinc and chromium. Not only that, but when you dig a little deeper, you learn that the spectrum also shows the presence of magnesium. But for whatever reason, they simply don't label this on the graph. Here's how we know that magnesium is there. In other spectra from their paper, such as figure 24 for example, you find a magnesium spike at 1.3 keV. Compare this against figure 14 and you see a spike in the exact same locations, but they simply didn't label it on this graph. Magnesium does appear to be present in the red section of the chips, as the very chemical analysis conducted by truthers shows us, and zinc and chromium are also present as well. Simply ignoring this or failing to label these elements doesn't make them disappear. And this obvious misstatement is coming from architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth. I'm just going to assume that their founder Richard Gage wrote this article because it makes my next joke funnier. This guy apparently can't read his own chosen source material. I mean, you'd expect an architect of all people to have a little more attention to detail. Dude's building designs are probably the sloppiest shit you've ever seen. They're like, Mr. Gage, was this drawing completed on a napkin in crayon after you'd cleaned up a mustard stain with it? Niels Harrod, in a paper titled Why the Red-Gray Chips Are Not Primer Paints, does concede that the zinc and chromium are there in the samples. But in an attempt to save face and continue believing the thermite hypothesis, he presents one of the most laughable evasions I've ever heard in my life. Quote, "The signals from zinc and chromium could be from a surface contamination with primer paint," ends quote. Let's recap everything that's being claimed here so we can truly appreciate the stupidity and desperation of the statements. We're told by truthers that the red-gray chips are not primer paint because they don't contain zinc, chromium, or magnesium, which the primer paint should contain. To support this claim, they show us a spectrum of the red-gray chips, which shows that they actually do contain zinc, chromium, and magnesium, as we would expect if it was primer paints. Rather than accepting what's staring them in the face and saying, okay, this actually is primer paints, Harrod's explanation is that we're still looking at thermite, but it's thermite that unfortunately happens to have been contaminated by the very primer paint we're told isn't present in the sample. And it's the contaminating primer paint that's the dastardly source of these elements that the thermite should not contain. I mean, wow, what do you even say to that? This is like a Neo in the Matrix level evasion right here. I have to underscore it again because it's just amazing what's being claimed here. This guy wants you to believe that in the debris of a building that should contain enormous quantities of primer paints, this stuff that looks exactly like the primer paint and has the same chemical composition as the primer paint isn't actually primer paint, but it's thermite that was merely contaminated by this primer paint in a most unfortunate act of happenstance. Seriously, does that strike anybody as the most reasonable explanation here? This is like the straws that you're grasping at are also grasping at straws. Could anything better demonstrate that truthers are working backwards from their conclusion? It would be bad enough if all they were doing is saying, no, I think these elements are just contamination, but who knows from what source, because that alone would be an obvious case of special pleading, where they're rejecting something simply because it's inconvenient for them. But they're taking it way further than this and saying the source of contamination is the very thing that these chips couldn't possibly be made of. It's hard to even fully process how deeply illogical this chain of reasoning is. The key reason Harrod makes a contamination argument is that given the initial composition of the primer paint that was used on the towers, we'd expect much higher amounts of these elements than are seen in the red-gray chips. He tells us that the composition of the dried paint would be expected to be 34% zinc chromate and 12 to 17% talc, which contains magnesium. I would first point out that these numbers come from several calculations that he performs himself, which rely upon several potentially faulty assumptions, including an assumption about the degree of solvent evaporation we'd see. I'm not sure I trust this guy to get these things right. I'm really not trying to be rude here, but he hasn't exactly shown himself to have the most crack reasoning skills. On top of that, even if he got the numbers right, these girders were painted over 30 years before the collapse of the towers. Over such a long time period, who knows what sort of chemical reactions and weathering the primer paint underwent, and who knows what impact that may have had on the original chemical composition. composition. Is it more likely that over a 30-year period, some of the elements in this primer paint have degraded over time? Or is it more likely that a mere shortfall in only a few of these elements is best explained by a secretly designed incendiary nanothermite that was used in the greatest conspiracy of all time? Your answer to that question says a lot about the way that your mind works. Harrod's analysis suffers from another key problem as well. According to the Minerals, Metals, and Materials Society, quote, 7 steel companies supplied structural steel to the World Trade Center construction, end quote. It's quite possible that these companies applied different primer paints with different chemical compositions to the steel that they provided, meaning the sample Harrod is testing might not correspond to the primer paint he's expecting to see. Indeed, the pigment of the primer paint he's using in his analysis has a different chemical composition from one of the paints that NIST uses in one of their reports. When you add together the several different layers of mistakes and faulty assumptions being made here, the ugly resulting dogpile gives us no reason to believe what truthers tell us. Really, the icing on the cake here is a 2012 paper by James Millett of MVA Scientific Consultants. They analyzed the same red-gray chips found in World Trade Center dust samples and reached a very different conclusion. Quote, red-gray chips that had the same morphology and appearance as those reported by Harrod et al. In fitting the criteria of being attracted by a magnet and having the SEM EDS X-ray elemental spectra described in their paper, were found in the World Trade Center dust from all 4 locations examined. The FTIR spectra of the red layer were consistent with reference spectra of an epoxy resin and kaolin clay, end quote. And here we see a graph from their paper that shows this, with the red side of a dust chip at the top, kaolin clay in the center, and an epoxy resin at the bottom. The uncanny resemblance is very hard to miss. They elaborate in more detail as follows, quote, the SEM, EDS, and backscattered electron analysis of the cross-sections of the gray layer and the red-gray chip showed it to be primarily iron consistent with the carbon steel. The cross-sections of the red layer showed the presence of equant-shaped particles of iron consistent with iron oxide pigments and plates of aluminum silicon consistent with reference samples of kaolin. According to the Federation of Societies for Coatings Technology, sounds like a fucking exciting organization, by the way. Kaolin, also known as aluminum silicate or china clay, is a platy or lamellar pigment that is used extensively as a pigment in many segments of the paint industry. Iron oxide pigments are also used extensively in paints and coatings. Both kaolin and iron oxide pigments have been used in paints and coatings for many years. Epoxy resins were introduced into coatings in approximately 1947 and are found in a number of specially designed protective coatings on metal substrates. Conclusions: the red-gray chips found in the World Trade Center dust at 4 sites in New York City are consistent with a carbon steel coated with an epoxy resin that contains primarily iron oxide and kaolin clay pigments, end quotes. I'm sure the truther will just write this guy off as a paid shill, however. Comments on my previous 9/11 videos have accused me of being a paid shill as well. Like, how do these fucking morons even think this works? The director of the CIA sees one of my YouTube videos, and he's like, Agent Bakerfield, get in here. I want you to go to this guy's house and offer to pay him to lie about 9/11. And I get a knock at the door one day, and I'm like, can I help you? He's like, I'm with the CIA. How would you like money to lie about 9/11? And I'm like, yes, it's the perfect plan. I'll start by making a joke in my next video about how unlikely it is that the interaction we're having would ever actually occur. He's like, dude, that's fucking brilliant. Throw him off the trail. For real though, if any of you knew how little I made from YouTube, you'd almost wish I was a paid shill. And on that note, if any of you want to support my work financially, please go to patreon.com/askepticalhuman and take a look at the fantastic rewards I provide. He's like, what are you waiting for, Agent Bakerfield? Get over there and give this kid some money. In that same paper, Harrod et al. Implied that they've disproven the paint chip hypothesis in a second way, by immersing the red-gray chips in a paint-dissolving solvent and comparing their performance against what are actually known to be paint chips. Quote, the initial objective was to compare the behavior of the red layer with paint when soaked in a strong organic solvent known to soften and dissolve paints. Red-gray chips were soaked in methyl ethyl ketone, MEK, for 55 hours, with frequent agitation and subsequently dried in air over several days. The chip showed significant swelling of the red layer, but with no apparent dissolution. In marked contrast, paint chips softened and partially dissolved when similarly soaked in MEK, end quote. It's a reasonable enough idea, but I'm left with more questions than I am answers here. What types of paint chips did they use? Was it just one kind, a bunch of different kinds? Was it paint designed for the walls of your home, or was it paint designed to treat steel? Was it the exact paint used to coat the steel beams of the World Trade Centers? And given that several different paints were apparently used, did they test every single one of them? Was the paint subjected to the same kind of treatment that steel primer paint typically is, such as the baking of the paint at 350 degrees Fahrenheit for at least 10 minutes? Perhaps certain paints would be more or less resistant to dissolving than others. Perhaps the post-application baking of the paint alters the way it would react in such a solvent. There are so many different variables here and so much room for error that getting this experiment exactly right is absolutely essential. Unfortunately for us, they provide almost no details on how they went about performing this part of the experiment. And call me crazy, but I'm not comfortable assuming that they ran the experiment according to the most rigorous and flawless protocol down to the exact detail. I don't know what type of paints they're comparing the red-gray chips to, or how appropriate a comparison it is. They don't provide any specific details other than calling them paint chips, meaning this part of their experiment is far from conclusive. Seriously, how did you guys fail to mention these crucial details in your study? Were you testing the paint chips, or were you eating the paint chips? I would also add that even if they did use the exact primer paints that were used on the Twin Towers, and they even subjected them to the appropriate baking protocols, which I really fucking doubt, we can't overlook the fact that these red-gray chips were embedded in post-collapse dust samples for 5 years before being tested. This is an actual example of potential contamination, where some of the other materials in the dust could have coated the red-gray chips, perhaps even embedding themselves deeper in the matrix, and this of course could impact how they react when being soaked in MEK when compared against pure paint chips that weren't contaminated in this way. This part of their experiment is definitely an interesting idea in principle, but in execution it turned out almost completely worthless because we have no clue how they did it, so we have no clue if the comparisons are valid or not. The next part of their experiment is one that's frankly above my pay grade as a non-expert in chemistry, but I'll do my best to faithfully represent it and respond as best as I can. They write that, quote, red-gray chips were soaked in MEK for 55 hours with frequent agitation and subsequently dried in air over several days. We observed a clear migration and aggregation of the aluminum away from other elements and determined that elemental aluminum and iron oxide must be present. The thermite reaction involves aluminum and a metal oxide, as in this typical reaction with iron oxide. 2Al plus Fe2O3 yields Al2O3 plus 2Fe, molten iron, end quote. So basically, their analysis shows that the red section of the chips contains the key ingredients of thermite, elemental aluminum, and iron oxide. Yeah, well, we also saw that the red side of the chips contains other elements, including carbon, silicon, and yes, even the dastardly zinc, chromium, and magnesium, exactly as we would expect if they were paint chips. If all that these chips contained was elemental aluminum and iron oxide, they might indeed be onto something here, but that's not all that they contain. The consistent presence of these other elements makes no sense if the explanation is thermites, yet it makes perfect sense if the explanation is paint chips, because precisely these elements were present in the original primer paint mixture. It also strikes me as downright misleading to take a mixture of at least 7 different elements, present to us only 3 of them in isolation, and say, aha, exactly as we'd expect if it was thermites. It'd be like sorting through someone's laundry bin, only picking out the shirts and jackets and saying, aha, exactly as we'd expect if you had no legs. Okay, well what about the 10 pairs of pants in there that you're ignoring? Doesn't that sort of undermine your hypothesis a bit? I would also add that the only conceivable source of iron oxide is not a devious thermitic mixture. As we saw in the ingredient list of at least one of the primer paints used in these buildings, one of the pigments used in these paints was none other than iron oxide. So why cast aside this perfectly sensible explanation and say, no, it must have been thermites? It makes absolutely no sense. Oh, you don't trust this document from NIST? How about the ingredient list that Niels Harrit provides, which also shows iron oxide? How dare his own publication support the official story like this? On top of that, according to a 1998 paper by J.O. et al., the atmospheric corrosion of steel leads to the formation of several different iron oxides in the form of rust, so it's quite possible that this is another source of iron oxide in the samples. Perhaps this oxidation could have occurred on site after the construction of the buildings over that 30-year period, or perhaps it could have also occurred after the initial formation of the steel beams and prior to the application of the protective primer paint. Again, we are utterly drowning in straightforward, reasonable explanations, yet the truther clings to the life raft of an unnecessary grand conspiracy. What about the elemental aluminum? This appears to be the kicker here, because while it's not made clear in the paper, presumably one would only expect aluminum to be present in combination with other elements that it's chemically bound to, such as aluminum silicate in the form of the kaolin pigment that was used in the primer paint. Indeed, they write in the paper, quote, XEDS spectra were acquired from specific regions of high silicon, aluminum, and iron concentrations. Focusing the electron beam on a region rich in silicon, we find silicon and oxygen and very little else. Evidently, the solvent has disrupted the matrix holding the various particles, allowing some migration and separation of the components. This is a significant result, for it means that the aluminum and silicon are not bound chemically, end quote. Yeah, right, dude. I'm sure that aluminum just flaked off from your tinfoil hats or something. No, I see a major problem with their analysis here. They subjected the red chips to 55 hours worth of soaking in methyl ethyl ketone, which we're told is, quote, a strong organic solvent known to soften and dissolve paint, end quote. Isn't it possible that the aluminum has merely dissociated from the silicon as a result of being subjected to this strong organic solvent, which is known to soften and dissolve paint? They say it themselves in plain English, quote, evidently the solvent has disrupted the matrix holding the various particles, allowing some migration and separation of the components, end quote. I feel like they just solved the very mystery that they're presenting to us. I don't find it particularly crazy that if you soak some paint chips in a strong dissolving agent for 55 hours, some of the compounds might start to break down into their constituent elements. Probably the strongest evidence they have is when they claim to have actively brought about thermitic reactions in the laboratory from these red chips. Impossible to argue against, right? Well, let's take a closer look. Quote, how does the material behave when heated in a sensitive calorimeter? If the material does not react vigorously, it may be argued that although ingredients of thermite are present, the material may not really be thermitic. Red-gray chips were subjected to heating using a differential scanning calorimeter. The data shown in figure 19 demonstrate that the red-gray chips from different World Trade Center samples all ignited in the range 415 to 435 degrees Celsius, end quote. They then provide a link to video footage of Stephen Jones igniting one of these so-called thermite chips with an oxyacetylene blowtorch. Quote, the first World Trade Center red-gray chip so tested was approximately 1 millimeter by 1 millimeter. After a few seconds of heating, the high-speed ejection of a hot particle was observed under the hand of the person holding the torch. The intense light and bright orange color of the particle attest to its high temperature. In this case, the attempt to recover the diminutive end product of the reaction was unsuccessful. A short video clip of the test, including slow motion, is available here, end quote. Let's check out this incredible video clip for ourselves. Dude, consider the official story debunked. If that barely visible flash right there doesn't prove it to you, then nothing will. I'm actually worried that that guy died during the explosion. Is he okay? They then argue that the almost literal smoking gun is the formation of iron microspheres after the chips are heated. Quote, in the post-DSC residue, charred porous material and numerous microspheres and spheroids were observed. Many of these were analyzed, and it was found that some were iron-rich, which appear shiny and silvery in the optical microscope, and some were silicon-rich, which appear transparent or translucent when viewed with white light. The abundant iron-rich spheres are of particular interest in the study. None were observed in these particular chips prior to DSC heating. Spheres rich in iron already demonstrate the occurrence of very high temperatures, well above the 700 C temperature reached in the DSC, in view of the high melting point of iron and iron oxide. Such high temperatures indicate that a chemical reaction occurred, end quote. And here we see images of some of the iron microspheres they refer to. Alright, so let's go through piece by piece here. First, there's a glaring issue with the ignition of these chips in the DSC. Quote, the red-gray chips from different World Trade Center center samples all ignited in the range 415 to 435 C, end quote. Without realizing it, they appear to have just resoundingly and conclusively disproven their own hypothesis. In a publication on thermite, United Nuclear writes the following, quote, "Thermite is typically very difficult to ignite, requiring a temperature of over 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit or 1650 C just to get the reaction started. It will not ignite using ordinary safety fuse or from contact with open flame," end quote. So to start a thermitic reaction requires temperatures in excess of 1600 degrees Celsius. The red-gray chips ignited at temperatures as low as 415 C, almost 4 times lower than that required to start an actual thermitic reaction. If that's not a checkmate right there, I don't know what is. Once again, what they're claiming is proof of thermite is actually proof of the opposite. I would also note that building fires get much hotter than 415 C. NIST reports that, quote, "normal building fires and hydrocarbon, for example jet fuel fires, generate temperatures up to about 1100 degrees Celsius. NIST reported maximum upper layer air temperatures of about 1000 degrees Celsius in the World Trade Center towers," end quote. So if these red-gray chips are ignited at about 430 C, why would the building fires alone not immediately trigger a cascading thermitic reaction? Nothing that they're arguing here makes any sense. AE 911 Truth, in an article of theirs, responds to the frequently asked question, quote, "Wouldn't the plane slamming into the Twin Towers have disturbed the demolition devices?" end quote. They answer this query by quoting another paper by Stephen Jones, who's one of the lead authors of the main paper we've been examining in this video, quote, "It is important to note that initiating the thermite reaction requires temperatures well above those achieved by burning jet fuel or office materials," end quote. Notice they're trying to have it both ways, and they don't realize they contradict themselves. They point to the ignition temperatures of these red-gray chips as proof that we're looking at thermitic demolition material. When people ask why did the building fires not ignite the thermite charges, we're told that building fires aren't nearly hot enough to ignite the thermite charges that were used in the towers. Well, the ignition temperature of these red-gray chips is much lower than the temperature of building fires. So if these chips are the thermitic material that was used, the building fires should in fact have ignited them. At least one of the claims they're making here has to be false because there's an obvious contradiction. The simplest explanation is that they're simply wrong about these red-gray chips being thermite. They try to explain this discrepancy in the paper by saying, but this is no ordinary thermite here. The material that they used was super thermite. Then they compare the DSC graph from the red-gray chip against one that was obtained from some so-called super thermite. As we can see, the super thermite reaction peaks at about 530 C, which while yes, much lower than conventional thermite, is still 100 C hotter than the peak ignition temperature of the red-gray chips. The explanation is obvious. What we're looking at is not super thermites. Here we're looking at extra super thermites. I've heard they're working on thermite so advanced that that shit will ignite at room temperature. All you have to do is breathe on that shit and consider your building demolished. Notice that even if this super thermite explanation was correct, which you'll be shocked to hear I find unlikely, it doesn't answer the question of why did the building fires not trigger this reaction if building fires get much hotter than this. I can only think of one possible way that the truther could reconcile all of these different assertions. They would have to argue that after the nanocomposite material was sprayed onto the steel beams, presumably on top of the existing primer paints, all traces of which magically disappeared from the debris, a further insulating layer was sprayed on top of the spray-on thermite to protect it from being ignited by the building fires. If you're creative enough, you can always pile additional layers onto a conspiracy to explain away contradictions and to try to maintain coherence. But there's a certain point you have to reach where you're like, are these dozens of cockamamie assumptions I'm making all completely accurate? Or am I simply wrong about the facts and digging myself deeper in a hole to save face? In another graph, they show us DSC traces for 4 of the red-gray chip samples. They then write that, quote, "The energy is released over a short period of time, shown by the narrowness of the peak in figure 29. If a paint were devised that incorporated these very energetic materials, it would be highly dangerous when dry and most unlikely to receive regulatory approval for building use," end quote. The energy is released over a short period of time, they tell us. Curiously, they don't tell us how short a time they're talking about. It may may look impressive on the graph, and they certainly do a good job of selling it using all kinds of dramatic language, but Oystein of Debunked.org explains it in such a way that it takes a lot of the wind out of their sails. Quote, "It is wrong to say they ignite at about 430 C, when two of the chips are already releasing relatively large amounts of energy very fast, at temperatures below 400 C. In fact, these two plots rise so steadily and smoothly towards their peaks that it is difficult to pinpoint where they ignite at all. This is indicative of a material that has no fixed ignition points. I'd assume this paint has a binder made from several organic materials, such as linseed oil plus resin plus whatever. What happens there is that the organic matrix decomposes, is cracked into smaller molecules, adds temperature increases, and the released gases, benzene, carbon monoxide, methane, H2, whatever, ignite at various rates and ignition points. Also, when reading these DSC plots, you need to understand that the x-axis, degrees Celsius, is actually equivalent to a timescale. The samples were heated at a constant rate of 10 C per minute, and net energy flow is determined relative to an inert control probe and plotted on the y-axis. So with every 10 C that you move to the right in the plot, a minute has passed. When, for example, the green curve exceeds 10 watts per gram at 400 C, then peaks at 430 C and 21 watts per gram, 3 full minutes have passed between these two events. It will go on releasing more than 10 watts per gram another 2 to 3 minutes. This is a tiny sample. We are talking about a chip that's 0.1 millimeters thin, and something like 1 millimeter long, and the green curve, burns for 5 minutes at a greater rate of energy release than the peak of the blue curve. Is this a powerful material? By no stretch of the imagination. It merely smolders peacefully." End quote. So it's not like all this energy is being released in a few milliseconds or something. These are several minute-long periods we're talking about here. Please show me a controlled demolition using explosive charges, which individually take several minutes to fully explode. They say this material would be unsafe for building construction. I say it would be ineffective for building demolition. In the paper, they also show that some of the red-gray chips actually have comparable amounts of energy per unit mass, as do explosives like HMX, TNT, and also the energetic composite AlFe2O3. As they write, quote, "A graph in an article on nanostructured energetic materials shows that the energy per volume yield for AlFe2O3 composite material exceeds that of TNT, HMX, and TATB explosives commonly used in demolitions. It is striking that some of the red-gray chips release more energy in kilojoules per gram than does ordinary thermite, as shown in the blue bar graphs above. The theoretical maximum for thermite is 3.9 kilojoules per gram. We suggest that the organic material in evidence in the red-gray chips is also highly energetic, most likely producing gas to provide explosive pressure." End quote. We have to stop and think about this for a second. Merely containing a certain amount of energy per unit mass doesn't mean that the object is an explosive or incendiary. Most objects that you see in the world around you will contain a certain amount of energy, by virtue of the chemical bonds that exist within that object. Are we to conclude that all objects which contain energy will therefore function as interchangeable explosives? It's just not as simple as they make it look in their graph. Let's expand this graph and compare the explosives in red-gray chips against the energy content of food nutrients. On average, carbohydrates contain 17 kilojoules per gram, over 3 times as much as TNT. I guess that explains why sugary frappuccinos give me such terrible explosive diarrhea. Protein also contains about 17 kilojoules per gram. Alcohol contains 29 kilojoules per gram, and fat contains 38 kilojoules per gram. Does that mean that smearing some fatty acids and alcohol onto the steel beams of the Twin Towers would have made for an even more effective controlled demolition? Something tells me that's not the way this works. And even if we granted, for the sake of argument, that an energetic nanothermitic paint was indeed sprayed onto the core columns of the Twin Towers, Mick West makes a very important point about this on Debunked.com. Quote, "There's not a lot of heat energy in a thin layer of nanothermite. It would not really have been able to heat up the core columns much." End quote. This is an excellent point here. Watch any footage of thermitic reactions, and you see that it takes a fairly large quantity to produce a sizable reaction. How on earth could a 2 millimeter thick layer sprayed onto the core columns produce anywhere near enough heat energy or explosive force to sever the extremely thick steel steel beams that it takes to hold up an enormous, towering skyscraper. None of their arguments make any sense when you actually stop to think about them. Perhaps you'd say, well, maybe they used much bigger thermite charges. As I argued in my other 9/11 videos, that position has many other glaring problems, including the contradictory claims that thermite was used as an incendiary to silently slice the steel beams, and the alternative claim that the towers were violently exploded downwards with such force that it hurled multi-ton building sections laterally. Setting those contradictions aside, there's also another issue before us as well. Why, if much larger thermite charges were used, do we only find these very small paint-like chips of thermite in the debris? Again, the simplest and most obvious explanation is that all we're seeing here are paint chips. And why would there be so much unreacted thermite left in the debris? Are the brilliant masterminds behind this perfectly executed building demolition also such inept fuck-ups that a bunch of their demolition material didn't even properly ignite? Dude, I totally forgot to rig up all that thermite that they found, but the building demolition still worked flawlessly. What about the ignition video of that so-called thermite chip? Well, he is using an oxyacetylene torch here, which can reach temperatures as high as 3,480 degrees Celsius. I'm sure you can blast a lot of different materials with a flame that hot, and you'd cause them to quickly and brightly burn up in a similar manner. They note in the paper that, quote, several paint samples were also tested, and in each case, the paint sample was immediately reduced to fragile ashes by the hot flame. This was not the case, however, with any of the red-gray chips from the World Trade Center dust, end quotes. Okay, well, recall that we have no idea if the unspecified paint samples you're using are at all comparable to the World Trade Center primer paints, so this comparison really doesn't have any force behind it. I might show you two 100-meter dash times, but unless you know what's being compared, it's not very informative. I might be comparing two healthy 25-year-old males, but I also might be comparing an elephant against a cheetah, or Usain Bolt against a stumbling, drunk old man. Until we get details about the comparison, we won't get value from the comparison. They also describe the red-gray chips as reacting vigorously or violently when subjected to heat. I'm sorry, but this video footage just doesn't look very violent to me. It's about as violent as movie night at Mitt Romney's house. They point out that, quote, in a later flame ignition test, the end product was recovered in the formation of iron-rich semi-spherical shapes, shows that the residue had been melted, enabling surface tension of the liquid to pull it into spherical shapes, end quotes. This isn't very remarkable considering that the oxyacetylene flame you're subjecting the chips to is over twice as hot as the melting point of iron, which is about 1540 C. More difficult to explain are the microspheres that formed in the DSC test, which subjected the chips to temperatures much lower than the melting point of iron. This, we're told, is proof that a chemical reaction occurred, and that's what created the microspheres. This, I think, is the single best piece of evidence they point to. One explanation they failed to consider, however, is the thermodynamic size effect, as explained by Dave Thomas. Quote, the answer to the mystery of the microspheres is simply that very small metal particles have much lower melting points than their bulk material counterparts, around 900 C for iron nanoparticles, as opposed to 1530 C for bulk iron. This is called the thermodynamic size effect, end quote. He also shows that if you burn steel beams coated in primer paint in an ordinary wood fire, which does not reach the melting point of bulk iron, you can nonetheless create iron microspheres. Here we see two such spheres that were created, along with their EDX spectra showing that they are indeed primarily made of iron. Thomas says that the melting point of iron nanoparticles is around 900 C, but his own experiment seems to show that it might be even lower than this, given that wood fires range between 300 and 600 C, yet in his experiment, a wood fire was hot enough to create iron microspheres. The temperatures reached in wood fires are also comparable to those reached in the Herod et al. DSC tests. So I see no need to invoke thermite as our explanation for how these microspheres formed. In addition to the microspheres that form from these red-gray chips, truthers will also note that in the dust samples themselves, you can also find large quantities of such microspheres. Here's what they argue in 9/11 Explosive Evidence.
As much as 6% of the World Trade Center dust consisted of tiny, previously molten iron spheres. What does this tell us about the temperatures generated in the tower's destruction?
When the USGS collected samples of the World Trade Center dust, they found the iron microspheres. Insofar, the USGS does not have a valid explanation for the presence of these iron microspheres.
He is correct that the USGS did present an analysis of the World Trade Center dust, and they did observe the presence of iron microspheres. But notice that this guy is faulting them for not going out of their way to refute conspiracy theories in a publication whose purpose was not to do that. In the publication he's referencing, the USGS writes that, quote, other laboratories are currently studying World Trade Center dust for other purposes such as health effect studies. To assist in interlaboratory consistency for identification of World Trade Center dust components, this particle atlas of phases in World Trade Center dust has been compiled, end quote. All they're doing here is presenting a straightforward list of the components of the dust. The goal wasn't to explain the specific origin or the mechanism of formation of these particles, and it certainly wasn't to present a comprehensive rebuttal to conspiracies about the dust particles. It'd be like reading a study that provides a straightforward description of the morphology and genome of a certain virus, and saying, notice that the CDC didn't say anything to refute the claim that this virus was a bioweapon created by our government. Yeah, and why would they? Why is that the expectation here? I don't find it a very interesting or forceful criticism to say that they didn't explain what it wasn't their goal to explain. But fine, if you want a published explanation, check out the paper titled Materials Characterization of Dusts Generated by the Collapse of the World Trade Center. There they write the following, quote, spheres of iron-rich phases, primarily oxides, were also detected. These spheres were likely produced during welding or cutting of steel during construction or rescue operations, end quote. And here we see an image of one such sphere from the paper. Truthers are yet again making their signature mistake of failing to consider or rule out alternative explanations before immediately jumping to a ridiculous one. In his book, Escaping the Rabbit Hole, Mick West points out that there are many prosaic explanations for these iron microspheres. Quote, you can easily make millions of microspheres with common construction activities, such as arc welding, angle grinding, or hammering steel. Shielded from the elements inside the building, these microspheres could last for decades, until the eventual collapse of the building freed them into the dust. Microspheres are also created by mundane items, like the sparks from cigarette lighters or flint igniters used by steelworkers. The pre- and post-collapse fires would create them by burning small pieces of iron dust. You can make them yourself by burning steel wool, but also by burning other things, like laser printer toner and printed documents. The toner contains iron. After the collapse, there was a lot of iron that needed to be cut to be removed, and the cutting produced huge amounts of iron microspheres which ended up in the general site dust, end quote. He also notes that if thermite was indeed the source of the microspheres, you'd find another key piece of evidence that's simply not there in the World Trade Center dust samples. Quote, not only are iron microspheres an expected component of the dust, that same dust was also missing an expected product of thermite combustion. When thermite burns, it makes twice as much aluminum oxide by volume as it does iron. When we burn thermite, we find many white aluminum oxide spheres and large number of hybrid eyeball spheres with a dark iron sphere embedded in a larger white oxide sphere. These were absent from descriptions of the dust. The simplest explanation is that the iron spheres are from mundane sources and thermite was not used, end quote. I also want to add one general point about the main paper we've examined in this video. Stephen Jones, one of its lead authors, rarely fails to remind us that this paper was published in a peer-reviewed journal, proudly mentioning it every chance he gets.
This is discussed in our paper in the Open Chemical Physics Journal, published in April of 2009. But so far, none of these papers have been refuted in the literature, the scientific literature. So that means they are unchallenged in the scientific sense. They stand as an indictment, really, of the official story of 9/11. I have some awareness of the importance of peer review, and I can say, in all honesty, that my first paper on 9/11 research met with considerable flack, and it was reviewed, peer-reviewed very heavily, actually. And before publication, it was thoroughly peer-reviewed. I have published over 50 peer-reviewed papers in my career, but we put a lot of work into this peer-reviewed publication.
Look, just as a matter of logic, the mere fact that a certain study has made it through the peer review process doesn't automatically make its conclusions valid, its arguments sound, or its methodology unimpeachable. Published papers can, in fact, contain falsehoods, mistaken assumptions, or examples of poor reasoning. And if you publish in a 9/11 Truth Journal, those things are actually requirements. Jones also claims that the arguments made in the paper haven't been refuted in the scientific literature. Even if we said that was true, again, that doesn't make the claims correct. If I were to go on a street corner and start ranting and raving about Jesus, the fact that the people walking by ignore me and don't take the time to challenge my assertions doesn't automatically make them valid. On top of that, since he talks so glowingly about the peer review process that they went through, it's worth pointing out that the journal this paper was published in isn't exactly the most prestigious in the world. They only published 5 issues before discontinuing, and in the book Debunking 9/11 Myths, they point out that the peer review process at this journal might in fact have been deeply inadequate. Quote, "The Open Chemical Physics Journal is one of over 250 peer-reviewed open access journals published by Bentham Science, according to the company's website. At least 2 US researchers have found Bentham's peer review process highly suspect." In January 2009, after receiving numerous spam emails from Bentham soliciting articles, Philip Davis, a PhD student at Cornell University, and Kent Anderson of the New England Journal of Medicine tested the process at the Bentham's Open Information Science Journal. They submitted a nonsensical computer-generated paper titled Deconstructing Access Points and listed the Center for Research in Applied Phrenology, CRAP, as their home institution. 4 months later, the journal accepted the article after supposed peer review, according to David's correspondence with Bentham, which then asked him to send $800 to the Sharjah Airport International Free Zone, a tax-free haven in the United Arab Emirates, for its publication. At that point, David retracted the paper, saying, "We have discovered several errors in the manuscript which question both the validity of the study and the results," and never heard from Bentham again. "We cannot conclude that Bentham science journals practice no peer review," David wrote, "only that it is inconsistently applied. More inconsistencies surround the publication of Jones' paper on nanothermite, specifically concerning lines of communication at the journal in which it appeared. The editor-in-chief of the Open Chemical Physics Journal, Marie-Paul Polenny, wasn't even aware of the appearance of Jones' work until reached by reporters. She immediately resigned her position at the chemical physics publication. They have printed the article without my permission," she explained to the news site, according to a translation. "I cannot accept that this topic is published in my journal. The article has nothing to do with physical chemistry or chemical physics, and I could well believe that there is a political viewpoint behind its publication. If anyone had asked me, I would say that the article should never have been published in this journal, period." End quote. So publishing something in this journal isn't exactly something to brag about. By the way, in the description of this video, if you're interested, you can find a link to both books I mentioned here, Escaping the Rabbit Hole by Mick West and Debunking 9/11 Myths by Dunbar and Reagan. Full disclosure, as an Amazon associate, I earn from qualifying purchases. Herod et al. Conclude in their paper as follows, quote, "Based on these observations, we conclude that the red layer of the red-gray chips we have discovered in the World Trade Center dust is active, unreacted thermitic material, incorporating nanotechnology, and is a highly energetic pyrotechnic or explosive material," end quote. This conclusion is simply not justified by the facts. The most reasonable explanation is that these red-gray chips are simply fragments of the primer paint that we know was applied to the steel of these buildings. The chemical composition and physical appearance of these chips matches up with the primer paint, so why overcomplicate things with incredibly layered conspiracies? Finding large quantities of primer paint in the debris is exactly what we would expect, and truthers make no attempt to distinguish it from the thermite chips, instead claiming that every apparent paint chip actually is the thermite. This to me is a clear indication that they've gotten their explanation wrong. An independent analysis of these chips agrees with this mundane paint explanation. Truthers claim that key ingredients of the primer paint aren't present in the red-gray chips, but their own chemical analyses refute this claim. They also provide dubious comparisons with unspecified paint chips that aren't really of any experimental value. The ignition temperature of these chips is inconsistent with thermites, and if the explanation is nanothermite, that doesn't explain why the building fires didn't trigger a reaction. Misleading graphs in the paper don't accurately capture how long the reactions take, and also conflate merely containing energy with releasing that energy explosively. Even if we granted that nanothermite was used in the way they say it was, a thin layer of nanothermite wouldn't be nearly enough to sever the structural beams of a skyscraper. So even when you let them run this argument to the end zone, the points they score are for the wrong team. The temperatures of building fires apparently can generate iron microspheres through what's called the thermodynamic size effect, and the abundance of microspheres in the dust is easily explained by ordinary construction activities and other potential sources. Thank you guys for watching this video. I hope you found it enjoyable and informative. And before you go, big announcements. My merch store, skepticalstuff.com, is officially online, and you can head on over there and purchase some fantastic and hilarious t-shirt designs. My personal favorite that I have up there, I think, is the God Works in Mysterious Ways shirt. It's basically God's hands coming out of a cloud and pushing this big red button that says Send Tsunami. Hilarious. I love that one. Another good one is Republican Breakfast. It's a picture of this stereotypical Republican-looking dude, you know, like 40-plus Caucasian male with a mustache, and instead of eating a bowl of cereal for breakfast, he's eating a bowl of bullets. That's a good one as well, in my view. Basically, the idea behind the merch store is just, like, funny t-shirt designs and other stuff, like coffee mugs and posters that tackle the same subjects I do on my channel, like politics, conspiracy theories, pseudoscience, global warming, stuff like that, and also take the same viewpoints that I do on those subjects as well. Most of the designs, I try to make them funny, and it's a good way to support the channel in a manner that's different from conventional, like, Patreon support or something like that, because here it's more just like, it's a transaction. You purchase a shirt, you get a tangible item that you get to wear, but I also make some money as well from it, so head on over there, skepticalstuff.com, check it out, and consider purchasing a t-shirt today. That's all for now. Thank you guys for watching and listening, and until next time, take care.